This is the first episode of the Dropout Podcast. At the airport, or when crossing borders, you must have seen these large and, mind you, incredibly adorable dogs that go about sniffing a person, their luggage, their car, what have you. These dogs have one job and one job only: to smell and detect suspicious substances. Often drugs and ammunition, but it could be anything. Dogs can do this because, well, for one, they're very good boys and can be trained quite effectively. But the reason they're so good at this job is because they have an incredible sense of smell. We refer to smell as olfaction in scientific literature. Relative to other mammals, your rodents, cats, and dogs, humans are awful at the sense of smell. And yet, we have such strong emotions associated with what we have smelled. The smell of nostalgia in a room that might have seen better days. The smell of texture and comfort in the way an old book smells. The smell of excitement in the earthy petrichor when the first drops of rain meet the ground. The smell of vastness. The smell of a new day. And what if I told you that there's a person out there who can smell diseases on people? Not any old disease. Parkinson's disease. It is a horrifying neurodegenerative disease that slowly impairs the parts of our nervous system that control our movements. It starts with tremors and a resting hand. It goes away when the person moves the hand. It moves on to bradykinesia, where the ability to initiate a voluntary movement slows down progressively in how fast a person can choose to move and in the range of movements that they may choose to perform. Rigidity of the muscles and the inability to maintain balance and posture are the later stages in the disease. It is not just the muscles and the motor system that gets impaired, the person's mind does too. They progressively decrease in their cognitive executive functions: how to plan, how to adapt, how to think in the abstract and figure out rules. They decline in their inhibition, their ability to pay attention, and keeping track of the present in their working memory. Dementia is very common among those diagnosed with Parkinson's. Depression, apathy, and anxiety are the most common changes in behavior as the disease progresses, and the list goes on. This disease typically affects people who are above 50 to 60 years old. The average life expectancy after a diagnosis is between 7 to 15 years. In 2015, 6.2 million people were affected by Parkinson's globally, and it took the lives of 117,000. There are only treatments that reduce the effects of the symptoms to improve the quality of life. Parkinson's has no cure yet, and we don't really understand the cause of the disease either. To make matters worse, unlike the way we detect COVID or diagnose diabetes, we don't really have a reliable biomarker test that can definitively diagnose somebody with Parkinson's, and more critically, before they show the symptoms of neurological degeneration. And the person that's out there, one of the many super smellers in the world, can smell Parkinson's on a person, the way someone smells the sweaty must of a shirt after a run, perhaps. The protagonist of our story here is Joy Milne. In 2012, at a Parkinson's public outreach event in Scotland, her talent was kind of accidentally discovered when she asked a Parkinson's UK research fellow if people with Parkinson's smelled different. Not knowing the answer to a question, the research fellow cited the only evidence he knew about smell in relation to Parkinson's. That is, a loss of smell is a symptom of Parkinson's. But that is not what Milne asked. What Milne had asked was something that nobody was thinking about. Restless about what this could mean, 6.5 months later, she was invited to take part in a pilot study. The study was simple. There were 12 t-shirts that she had to smell. 6 of them belonged to people who were diagnosed with Parkinson's, and the other 6 belonged to healthy control subjects. She scored a 11 out of 12. That is, she identified all 6 people from the Parkinson's group successfully, but misclassified one of the controls as having Parkinson's. Turns out, the misclassified person eventually did get diagnosed later with Parkinson's, bringing Milner's total accuracy to a perfect 100%. Her sense of smell is so sensitive that after the 2-hour pilot test, her nose became inflamed and sore. Her olfactory system is comparable to that of dogs, with the ability to discriminate between very similar odors. Milne is a nurse and was used to seeing patterns in observation and using those patterns to come up with a diagnosis. She had first noticed this distinctive smell on her husband, who had passed away from Parkinson's. When she would attend events about Parkinson's disease, she noticed that some of the people she had met had the same odor as her late husband. Could it be connected? Milne certainly thought so. After Milner's incredible abilities were documented in a press release, it turns out that she isn't the only person who noticed that unique odor. Multiple reports came forward by people who claimed that they could also smell Parkinson's and that there was a common pattern in what they were all saying. For one, it is a very unique smell, like nothing else that I'd smelled before, and that it was a very pervasive smell and that it stuck to clothing. It was a kind of smell that you can't ignore, the kind of smell that sort of lingers around. And lastly, the smell seemed to present itself early into the diagnosis of Parkinson's, and that it completely went away when they were treated for the disease. But rather curiously, the smell comes back in the later stages of the disease, and this often coincides with when the treatment stops being effective. In Joy's case, she reported that she could smell that odor for at least 6 years before her husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. 6 years! Naturally, many scientists in neuroscience express their reservations about Milner's ability. However, beyond the skeptics lay a bunch of scientists who were overwhelmingly encouraging about what this could mean for research into detecting Parkinson's. One such scientist encouraged people to have an open mind, as he wrote in the Lancet Neurology, saying that it is within the realm of possibility that there are certain byproducts of molecular metabolism that make people with Parkinson's unique. These byproducts, metabolites as they're known, make their way into the sebaceous secretions of the skin. Another scientist lent the support in how the identification of a biomarker, particularly one that could be validated for Parkinson's, would improve the ways that research and clinical trials for the disease are being carried out. A particular scientist from France made the claim, and I quote, "There is no reason to be too negative just on principle. It is too early to conclude, but the scientists who are testing this hypothesis seem to have a fair, objective, controlled and blind approach." End quote. This was in reference to the pilot study. What I find fascinating is the manner by which Joy's experience is translated into potential hypotheses. She had said that the peculiar odor was confined to the back collars of shirts and that there was almost nothing that could be detected in the armpits of the shirt. To a biotechnology scientist, what they understood from this was that it is possible that the odor is, and I quote, "associated with the acyclic molecules that are more likely to be secreted through a more hydrophobic medium," unquote. What this means is that the potential biomarker in question is more readily found in the oily sebum of our skin rather than our sweat, which is probably why Joy could detect the smell at the part of the shirt that meets the back of our neck, rather than the sweat of armpits. The general idea is clear. If we can isolate the molecule that is responsible for the unique smell, the kind that Joy and others like her can detect, then it is possible that we could diagnose Parkinson's much earlier than we can now. We could track how it progresses and how effective the treatments are as a result of how the smells change. This would be an absolute game changer in diagnostic medicine, because the present way to diagnose someone with a disease is by looking at their symptoms. The issue is that earlier on in the disease's progression, these symptoms are not always predictive of Parkinson's. It turns out that early detection is remarkably important. A consulting neurologist in Manchester said that 60% of degeneration occurs before people are first diagnosed with Parkinson's. This means that potential treatments that protect neurons in the brain are more likely to benefit if the disease is caught early. This could help prevention medicine to the point where we increase the window of intervention where we can slow down the disease, or potentially prevent the symptoms from occurring altogether. If we could discover the biochemical pathways that produce these unique smelling metabolites, we could possibly find the enzyme responsible for Parkinson's, an enzyme that we hadn't thought about before. Block the enzyme and discover a new treatment, or potentially a cure. It is critical to understand that, as is typical with the process of science, that these are hypotheses and possibilities, and that these take a long time to test. However, from the research fellow at the public outreach event, down to the scientists at the analytical chemistry labs, everyone agrees that this is a story of serendipity. This is Joy's story. This episode was based on volume 15 of Lancet Neurology, published in February of 2016 by Jules Morgan. The link to this article will be in the video description. Thank you for listening to the Dropout Podcast. This is an experimental podcast as a means of conveying science in slightly more approachable ways. This is your host, Kaustav, dropping out.